And I went to a public school, and we had a Bible study every morning at 8 o'clock, and school started at 8:30. And my friend Julian Choi and I were taking turns leading this Bible study uh, after and another guy, Kyle Wigington, was he had started it. He had started the Bible study and then graduated. But I remember it became my turn to lead Bible studies, and so the first thing I did was I found a little book called Daniel for Teenagers, and we just went right through the book. And I remember what an encouragement it was to me back then. I hope you get to have a love for this book as well. Let's read the first chapter. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof that they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children of Israel that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat, and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. And as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all found he none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. Amen. All right, well, we come now to the end of the major prophets. And next week, my dad will give a one-off Bible message to us. And then we're going to take a break during the month of December from our road trip. And we'll pick it up. We'll pick it up in January with the minor prophets. And I'll tell you a little bit later what's going to happen in December. But for now, let's go ahead and review where we've been so far on our Route 66 through the 66 books of the Bible. Would you say them with me all the way to Daniel? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. All right, over to you, Dan.
For those of you who don't know, his middle name is Daniel. Had to share that. I'd like to share one other thing. That tomorrow's Thanksgiving, and it's a fun holiday unless you're a turkey. But it's a great holiday, and I got to love it over the years. If you know anything about the history, the people who came to America, the Pilgrims, came from this area of the world. They came from this area of the country. In the first year, in the first winter, half of them died from starvation. The next year, they got together and they got help from the Native Americans who were there in that area near Plymouth. And they had bountiful food. They had more food than they had since they came there. And so they had a feast. The first Thanksgiving, I think, was 5 days long. But they had a feast. They invited the Indians, and it was a wonderful time. We celebrated in America, always on the fourth Thursday of November. It is a time of thanksgiving to thank the Lord for his bountiful blessings. It truly is a Christian holiday. A lot of people don't celebrate it like that, but one of my favorite things is, and always has been for many, many years, and Jonathan has been with me, but on Thanksgiving morning, there's a mountain behind our house, and there's a place nearby where I go for breakfast and prayer and reading the Bible. And all my kids have been along with me, including my wife. So it is really what Thanksgiving is all about. We're in the book of Daniel, and Daniel was an amazing person in that Daniel was you would call him a believer who had a testimony in a pagan world, truly pagan world. There are two kinds of approaches you can have. You can look at the enemy, hate them, and always defy them and always resist them. Or you can be to the enemy a testimony of God, not to compromise your faith, not to compromise your beliefs, but to be a testimony to the effect that the kings, and there were four of them, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Cyrus, and Darius, they all looked at Daniel and his companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They looked at them they looked up to them. They admired them. They praised some of the things they did. Yes, they got angry at them at certain times, but they saw that they truly were people of God. And so Daniel is an amazing book. There are 12 chapters. Here's a bit of trivia for you. In the book of Daniel is the only place where you see a dictator, a killer, write a portion of the Bible. So a chapter in the book of Daniel was written by Nebuchadnezzar. A lot of people didn't realize that. But we're going to go through each chapter. I'm going to give you a little bit of each chapter and try to highlight some of the things. There are dreams mentioned in the book of Daniel. Daniel became an interpreter of dreams only through God. So we're going to go through some of those dreams. Some of them were immediate prophecies. That means prophecies that would be fulfilled within hundreds of years. And some of them are prophecies that go way into the future that still have not happened yet. So I'd like to start, if we just read chapter 1, I'd like to start with the children of Judah. These are named to be children. The Bible says that young people, people who are teenagers, should not look down on their youth, because God can use young people. We see that these are children. So we're not talking about 20-year-old or even 21-year-old. We're talking about that probably were 15, 16 years old. 16.
In the year 605 before Jesus Christ.
Yes. So they were teenagers in their mid-teens. They were not, you see in here, if you look in verse 4, children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning, in knowledge and understanding, science, and such as had ability in them, to stand in the king's palace, in whom they might teach the learning in the tongue of the Chaldeans. These were the best of the Hebrews. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among them these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And I want you to note right away that if you look throughout the book of Daniel, you always see Daniel referring to himself as Daniel. He does not refer to himself with his new name. Most of the time we refer to these young men as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But in reality, their true names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. In verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar. Don't confuse that with Belshazzar, which is a king. This is Belteshazzar. And to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. What's the significance here? The enemy wants to change the identity of the captives. He wants to change their identity, because if you look at their names and you look at their meanings, Daniel, and I would like to give a little plug to a website that I use all the time. It's called blueletterbible.org. You can get every word in the King James Bible and look at the original words from the Hebrew or the Greek, and you can see what it literally means. So Daniel literally means God is my judge. Hananiah literally is God has favored. Mishael is who is what God is. Azariah is Jehovah has helped. These were all godly names. The names that they were given, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Belteshazzar simply means Lord of the straitened treasure. Shadrach means the great scribe. Meshach is guest of a king, and Abednego, servant of Nebo. All four of those names are worldly names. They are names that show vanity, that Nebo is a false god. So these were names that were given to them to take away their identity. And if you want to relate this to today's world, people try to change your identity. They try to change the identity of Christians. You see this in the secular world, but even among Christians. You need to understand that you have a name. God has given you a name. And you are a person that God knows very well individually. And you are accountable to Him, not the world. The world may nickname you things that, that may be derogatory. I had kind of a compliment one time. Somebody nicknamed me Reb. And these two guys I worked with named me Reb. And I took it for a while, and finally I said, why are you calling me Reb? And I thought they were calling me a rebel. They were calling me Reb. The way they pronounce it is reverend, because I was always preaching the gospel to them. So I took it as a compliment. But you have to be careful with your name because of who you are in Christ. Okay, your identity is in Christ. Now, if you look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and Daniel, they may have changed their names, but did they ever change their identity? Did they ever change who they were in God? You know, they still loved God. They never gave up on the Lord. I want you to look at verse 17. 17. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. I won't go through all of what they did. We know the episode of the food, that they wanted to have a certain type of food as opposed to the king's food. And a lot of people say, well, they were vegans. Not necessarily. I think it had more to do with the fact that the food that was offered to them was somehow it was defiling their faith. Could have been pork, I don't know. Could have been dedicated to false gods. But in other words, they refused to eat the king's food because of the symbolic meaning behind it. And so they chose to stay true to their vows to God. Look in chapter 2. Chapter 2, we see a dream. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he forgets it. So he asks all of his magicians to not only interpret his dream, but he tells them, you tell me what my dream was, which is really tough. You know, the magicians are begging him, just tell us what your dream was, and we'll come up with something. But no, he says, you tell us, or you tell me what I dreamt. That's a tough one. And Nebuchadnezzar was the kind of person who probably was an okay guy until he got mad and then he wanted to kill people. So he was notorious for this. He was a cruel king. Chapter 2, verse 20. Finally, you know, they were about to kill all these men, all these magicians, including Daniel and his friends. And so Daniel finds out about this. It says in verse 19, then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. If we just realize that God is omniscient, he knows everything, then we would, benefit tremendously by asking him for wisdom instead of trying to seek wisdom for the world. These men understood it. Daniel understood it. He knew he couldn't interpret it, but he knew who could. If we come to the point where we say, I can't figure this out, God knows already what the problem is. A lot of times God is willing to resolve the problem. He's just waiting for us to ask. So this wisdom that is revealed here, he reveals to this king Nebuchadnezzar exactly what the dream is and what the interpretation is. Another interesting thing about what we just read, think about all the changes in leadership over the years. Sometimes we get angry, sometimes we get upset. We need to remember God knows who will be put in charge. And sometimes it's not because we are doing such a great job, but sometimes it's because the people are doing a bad job. So God punishes them by giving them a bad king or giving them a bad ruler. This is, by the way, where Daniel is. He's a captive. He is in Babylon, which is far away from his homeland. He is from Judah. He's a Judean. He doesn't want to be there. But he's put in this place, and God uses him in a foreign land. So in this dream, if you look at verse 38, and wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. So it's talking about this image that he saw of a statue that had 4 parts. It was gold, silver, brass, and iron. And each part represented a kingdom. It was symbolic to a kingdom. The head was gold. He's referring to, that's who you are. You were at the top. In verse 39, and after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. We see here a prediction of 4 empires. We see Babylon. That's the first one. The silver one would be Persia. Persia would take over, Media Persia. And that's the silver arms. And then the thighs of this statue would become Greece. Alexander the Great. You've probably studied this period in history. And then the fourth one was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire would be the strongest. Look in verse 44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. There is no kingdom that you could say today, a human kingdom, that has ever qualified this. In other words, we've never had a kingdom that would stand forever, except for in the days of these kings. If you look at the Roman Empire, we do see that there was a kingdom established by Jesus Christ. And not the literal physical presence of Jesus Christ as a king, but we do see that the kingdom of heaven started with the church. So you would say that, as soon as you believe in Jesus Christ as Savior, you are a member of that kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom. However, this is also looking forward to the future, where we'll have a literal physical kingdom on this earth, where Jesus reigns on the earth. And that is that kingdom that shall never be destroyed. The kingdom of heaven is where Jesus Christ is the King of Kings. He is our King. We are, if we believe in Jesus Christ as Savior, we are now subjects to the King of Kings. Look in chapter 3. I'm going through these pretty fast, but I would like to at least mention something about each chapter. So in chapter 3, we see the fiery furnace. The young men have been required to bow down to the image of gold. We see that these young men, if you look in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spoke and commanded that they should heat the furnace 17 times more than it was wont to be heated. In other words, instead of 500 degrees, 3,500 degrees, I don't think it would make a whole lot of difference unless you were supernaturally protected. But he was mad. He was super, super mad. Like I said before, he had a temper problem. He had a pride problem. We see that Nebuchadnezzar ordered this. The men who bound him in there, they were pushing him in. They were slain. The men who actually took him in there. If you look at verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. We see here what's most likely a Christophany in the Old Testament. It's an appearance of Christ in a human form in the Old Testament. We don't know this for sure, but the fact that he viewed him as, that he looked as the Son of God, is an indication that it's very likely that this was a Christophany or an appearance of Christ. We see here that to application, if Christians are ever faced with death, faced with martyrdom, the enemy a lot of times thinks, if we threaten to kill them, they will change. They will change their minds. They don't want to die. And it's true that there are a lot of people who don't want to die, so they say, whatever you want, I just don't want to be thrown in a thing of fire, an oven of fire. These young men were like the martyrs that we've seen in history who say, no matter what, I am not going to deny the Lord, ever. It's easy for us to say that, but I sincerely pray that if that happened to me, that I would be the same as them. And I pray that you would be too. I pray that will never happen. But are we naive enough to think that it could not happen in this world? We've already seen it with Stephen. Stephen, right? Yeah. Is it possible for Christians to be persecuted for their faith? Absolutely. Chapter 4. Chapter 4, we see this is the chapter that he wrote himself. In fact, if you look at it, Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. He's giving an account. It must have been very humbling. He's giving an account of what happened to him personally. Nebuchadnezzar was a conqueror. He was brutal. He conquered the whole Middle East. He was the man, so to speak. He was rich. He had wealth. He had anything he wanted. He could do anything to anybody he wanted to. He was very powerful. And this man goes from that to writing an account of something that is probably the most embarrassing thing that could ever happen to a dictator. He has a dream, and in this dream, if you look at verse 25, in this dream, Daniel interprets it. He says in verse 25 that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen. They shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. He already saw what God could do, with Daniel's friends. He already saw that. Yet he was still prideful, and he was still an unbeliever, and he did not acknowledge God, or he did not trust in God. And so Daniel said, this is what's going to happen. In verse 26, and whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee, after that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. Wherefore, O king, let me counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Is it that it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility? In other words, Daniel says, if you hold back with your cruelty, maybe the Lord will prolong it, or he will postpone it. We don't know exactly what he did, but we do know that God postponed it for 12 months. Perhaps he listened to this prophecy, and maybe he backed off a little bit with his cruelty, and so God held off on this judgment. But 12 months later, in verse 30, in verse 29, at the end of 12 months he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, and for the honor of my majesty? Notice the first person pronoun. I, me, my. While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling place, thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven. Now he did return after those 7 times. Those 7 times most likely are in verse 34. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And by the way, I forgot to tell you, he crawled in the fields, in the jungles, wherever, like a madman. Sort of like a person who was totally crazy, had lost his mind. Nobody helped him out. He just lived out in the woods, so to speak. Lived like an animal. He was totally humiliated. But notice what he says. After he got his understanding back, he says, I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. If you read those words, and if you read this chapter, you get the feeling that this is a man who humbled himself and put his faith in the Lord. So if it can happen to a dictator, I believe it can happen to anyone. Chapter 5, we see here the writing on the wall. Chapter 5, the writing on the wall. This is a prophecy to Belshazzar. He had a very similar problem. He also was prideful. And there was a writing on the wall in verse 25, and this is the writing that was written, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That same night he died, he was killed, and Darius became king. And that takes us to chapter 6. This is a chapter about Daniel in the lion's den. Here's another example of being standing up for your faith. He was told that he could not pray to anyone anymore except for to God. Now, I love it, the fact that he he had a habit of being in his window, plain sight, people could see him, and he faced Jerusalem. I think Jerusalem is that way. No, that way? I think it's that way. But imagine he had a habit of facing Jerusalem, bowing down to God, and praying every day. And he was told that he couldn't do this anymore. Okay? A lot of people would say, okay, I'm going to go into my prayer closet so nobody can see me. But that was not his habit. His habit was not to be inside somewhere. His habit was, I'm going to pray right here in the window, and I don't mind if anybody sees me. Have you ever been embarrassed while you're in a restaurant because people see you pray? I think it's a great thing. I've had people come up to us saying, thank you for praying for your meal. We should not be embarrassed. If people see us pray, that's okay, whether it's in the town square like we did Monday. It's a badge of honor to be able to pray in public. And he did. He was tossed into the lion's den. Verse 18, then the king went to his palace. And by the way, the king didn't want to do this. King didn't want to throw him in the lion's den, but he was tricked into this decree, making this decree. In verse 18, then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste into the den of lions. And by the way, these are lions that were not fed for weeks on end, so they're very hungry. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Notice that he is acknowledging Daniel is continually serving the Lord. Do you understand the testimony that Daniel had, that he was not ashamed that people saw his lifestyle? I think it's very important for Christians to have consistency in their life when it comes to serving the Lord. Verse 22, My God hath sent his angel and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. Chapter 7 takes us to Daniel's dream. And in Daniel's dream, we see here a prophecy that's similar to what he has had before, but it gives us a little bit of it gives us the glorious future of this kingdom of heaven that we talked about before, but we also see a mention of Antichrist. We see here a mention of tribulation. For those of you who are not aware, I think most of you are, that rapture, after the rapture happens, there would be 7 years of tribulation. I want you to remember that number 7 years, because that comes into play here. Look in verse 13. Actually, let's read verse 9 and 10 first. Daniel 7, 9 and 10. I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. This is a picture of God. In verse 10, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him. That's millions. So you see millions ministering to God. And 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. That means 100 million people are standing before God. The judgment was set and the books were opened. Imagine us being there at that point. 100 million people standing before the throne. It says in verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. This is a picture of that kingdom of heaven. Notice all nations, all kingdoms. This is where you have truly a one world government, but not ruled by, and that will be where you can actually have peace on earth. This is a we'd call it a theocracy. Theocracy only works if Jesus Christ is king. If we tried to set up a theocracy on this earth, we couldn't do it. We would have all kinds of problems. But the only person who would qualify to set up a theocracy where God truly rules is Jesus Christ himself. He will be the example of the perfect kingdom on earth. In the meantime, before this happens, and this kind of goes, it's not in chronological order, but if you look at verse 21, it says, I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. So I'm skipping some verses here. This is a man who fights the saints, and this obviously is taking place during the tribulation period. Look at verse 22. Until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he saith, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down, and break it to pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand unto a time, and times, and the dividing of time. That last phrase, time, times, and dividing of times, is 3.5 years. It's exactly half of 7 years. This is where, what this is describing here is the Antichrist, so the man 666 that's mentioned in the book of Revelation. This is a man who will, according to what it says here, devour the whole earth. He will have enough power to be a ruler over the entire earth. There are 10 horns mentioned. That is a reference to 10 nations. So you have 10 leaders who are involved in this. I can't go into detail here, but I want you to understand that he is going to make war against the Most High, and ultimately that will end with the Battle of Armageddon at the end of that 7-year period. You have tribulation, that's 7 years, 3.5. First 3.5 years will be bad. Second half will be great tribulation. It'll be really bad. And I can't go into this now, but there are 7 trumpets, 7 vials mentioned in the book of Revelation that give us some of the terrible things that happened during that time period. Since I'm running out of time, I'll go over one more thing. So this is in Daniel chapter 9, and this is probably the most amazing prophecy in the Old Testament. And I'll close with this. But if you look in chapter 9, it gives a prophecy, and it does also mention, in this particular prophecy, it gives a hint of that last 7 years as well. Okay? But here you see a prophecy that is so specific, it gives years. It says exactly when this is going to take place. So look at, the first thing I want you to understand is the word week is not necessarily 7 days. The word week can also mean 7 years. It simply means 7. We know from the context, and we know from this, that this is referring to years. So I want you to understand, if you look at verse 24, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, and that, by the way, 70 times 7 would be 490 years, upon the holy city, and to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So this is referring to, from that point that he's about to describe, to Jesus Christ who would pay for sin, and then later on when the kingdom would start, that 1,000-year reign of Christ. So it's divided up into 2 parts. Look at verse 25. It says, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The streets will be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. This is a description of a breakdown of 483 years. Very specific. There were several decrees made, but this is reference to Artaxerxes' decree in 444 BC. It would take 49 years to restore what you see here described. To rebuild Jerusalem, it would take 49 years, so that's 7 weeks. And then another 434 years before Messiah. So if you look right there in verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. Cut off is a reference to be killed. So we see here a prophecy that describes the year Jesus Christ would die on the cross. We know that We know that the dating system is slightly off, so some people have said, well, it's just a couple of years off. But if you look at the history of age, we would probably recognize Jesus Christ was not born at 0 AD, but he was probably born 3 to 5 BC. But if you look at that age period, it is accurate to exactly when Jesus Christ would die on the cross. So this is a prophecy that absolutely tells us that Jesus is the Messiah. If you talk to Jewish people and say, well, we believe Jesus was an impostor. Well, Jesus fits this prophecy because we know when it was written, and we know when the decree was made, and we know the years that was described. And the last thing of this prophecy, verse 27, there is a separation between those 69 weeks and that last week. And the last week is 7 years. My son will probably get into this a lot more about the tribulation period, or you may have already taught about it. But during that tribulation period, that would be 7 weeks. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. That's a reference to the Antichrist. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Like I said, we can't get into detail, but that's a reference to the Antichrist coming and desecrating the temple. And will the temple be rebuilt? Well, in order for these prophecies to come true, yes, it has to be rebuilt. The plans are already in the making to rebuild this. There are a couple of other chapters left. They're awesome chapters. For those of you who don't notice, there is a Daniel chapter 13 and 14 that people have tried to add to the book of Daniel. And let me tell you, the Catholics have tried it, but I have read them. And it's very obvious that those chapters were forgeries that people tried to add to it. One of them is about Susanna. It's kind of a story about adventure, and Daniel rescues this woman named Susanna. And the other one is about a dragon, Bel and the Dragon. You may have heard of this. These are apocryphal books, but those are two apocryphal chapters that they added to the book of Daniel, but they have no business being there. And if you read them, you know the style is totally different.